Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Darsh Shah,
And I'm Dr. Altamash Raja,
and welcome to Medicine Redefined.
a podcast where we will explore the often overlooked but necessary components of health, what we consider to be the fundamentals.
We will investigate topics and practices that can give you and your patients the best chance to optimize a healthy lifestyle. It's time to move the needle forward and put the health back in healthcare. Welcome to an episode of The Progress Note. In medicine, the Progress Note is a medical record that documents a patient's clinical status or achievements during their care. It typically consists of four components: the subjective data, the objective data, the assessment, and lastly, the plan. It essentially is a systematic review in a point of time. Our goals with these episodes are to highlight mainstream practices, take a deeper dive, and approach polarized topics with nuance. While advancement is always happening in medicine, rethinking data as well as our beliefs is a rare occurrence. Join us as we continue to make progress, hold ourselves accountable, and redefine medicine. Altamash, do you want to quickly explain to our listeners kind of what our idea is here and what they can be looking forward to?
Yeah, man. I don't even know how to start. It's been so long. We've taken a little break, but I'm getting rusty. No, all jokes aside. So I think maybe it probably makes sense to first define what the term progress note means. I think many people, those in medicine, it's self-explanatory. You could probably tune out for the next 30 seconds or so. But for those not in medicine, progress note is kind of what it sounds like. It's a daily documentation that's supposed to be succinct for healthcare providers to communicate with each other with respect to the progress of the individual, right? The patient is usually the person in front of us. And so often that'll look at, overnight events or most recent events, or depending on what setting you are, in inpatient setting versus an outpatient setting. They'll kind of look at the brief history. It's broken out into different components. So there's a subjective component, which the patient usually will give you information. You'll take all that together in the data gathering phase. There's an objective component. That's where the physical exam falls in, the labs, and a lot of that data. Then there's an assessment that everybody makes towards the end. And there's a plan that you come up with, right? And so we'll try to, when applicable, keep it within the realms of that. But our hope was that, over the last couple of years, we've talked about all things in health, right? The mission is to add the health back in healthcare. And we've given its fair share to talking about nutrition. Now, it can be an incredibly polarizing topic, and it can be a really dense and complex topic as well. Unfortunately, what we've noted from time and time again, what's been happening, I wanted to say lately, but I'm sure it's been happening forever, that people are starting to, because the mediums for attention are getting shorter and shorter, the necessity to convey nuance when communicating, information in the nutrition realm is getting less and less. And so, we're getting these clickbait things where people are communicating things and almost suggesting that things are definitive, and that's not necessarily the case. And, people who cannot separate the signal from the noise, they tend to be the victims. And both you and I get information from our family members, people in our inner circle. They're always sending us links, and it's not just saying, "Hey, what do you think?" So, yeah, what is that? Hey, what are your thoughts, or something of that regard? And so our hope here is that maybe we can kind of take a trending topic, if you will, and kind of try to dissect it a little bit. Try to use some data without trying to bore you guys. And kind of help make sense of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll even expand that a little bit, right? To I'm sure the listeners want to understand what we do in our lives, right? Like, how do we take what we learn from our guests and apply it to our lives? So it could be like nutrition, it could be maybe some of the biohacks going on, it could be like, understanding what zone 2 cardio is now, right? Which is what Peter Attia is all about. And that's definitely something like I've incorporated a lot more. So like in the future, we're going to be touching on these topics. I mean, what Altamash does, what I do, how do we incorporate it, what kind of progress, we're making in our lives with our own health, and really sharing that with you all with, as much data as we can. But then again, trying to bring as much nuance to the topic, because we know it's not a one size fit all, and everyone has their own individual approach to become the healthiest version of themselves. So this should be fun. It should be a fun new project that that we brought into the show here. So cool.
So with that, let's set the stage a little bit, right? And I think that
Yeah.
um, what's going to spark the discussion here is kind of a few posts that both of us saw, maybe on Instagram. Was there any other social media platforms that you saw
No,
this
no,
stuff on that you're telling me is really
it's
Instagram?
Instagram mainly. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's where we tend to be most active. And, people have posted talking about how meat is the end all be all, the worst thing you could possibly put inside your body, right? And then people
Yeah.
definitively claiming that meat causes cancer and meat causes heart disease and meat causes erectile dysfunction. And there may be some truth to those things, which we'll get into. But just definitively making these statements how it's the worst possible thing, which can be very, very confusing. And then, of course, depending on how many people share and reshare, it gets more and more confusing. So I think that's the one that we're going to try to address today. I have no freaking idea how we're possibly going to do that and not be here all night.
Yeah.
But we'll do our best.
Absolutely. And so the topic today is, does meat kill you? And the answer is yes. Absolutely. You take one bite and you're drop dead on the ground. No, all jokes aside. So this stemmed from a post that we saw, where if you go on Google and you just type in "does meat cause," you get a drop down list right on Google. And obviously Google's looking for keywords, but a lot of those keywords are going to be related to health. So if you fill in the blank, you choose what to put in there: cancer, diabetes, heart attack, stroke. The list goes on. So when you read as a sentence is meat causes blank, meat causes blank, right? And you see all these harmful things. So that's what we're going to break down. But there's also this other set of posts that many of you may have seen, is when it compares cigarettes as a cancer risk to now the new cancer sticks, which are bacon, right? And I'm sure a lot of you guys may have seen that post that has been circulating, especially along a lot of the vegan influencers posting that to show that, hey, bacon are the new cancer sticks. So let's go in. Let's talk about our kind of biases, right? When we see a post like that, what is your initial reaction, your gut reaction that you take away?
Um, for me, okay, so I've made some growth over the last couple of years, right? That's the positive. And so now it's
Progress.
initially my my thoughts are, let me read the whole thing,
Okay.
right? Before
And
I try to, yeah, as
when
soon as I
when
see it.
when you say whole thing, do you mean the comments, or I mean, do you see like the caption, or
Yeah, the
okay,
caption, right? Because usually there's a reel or something like
yeah,
that, and or 20-second video or something, and then I want to go read the caption because hopefully the author has added some context to what they're trying to communicate. But initially there's a visceral reaction, but I've learned to kind of push that down a little bit more and not just scroll past it. And so I think, okay, that's interesting, and then I try to assess where that person's coming from. Ideally, and I find this just my analytical brain, the people who cite something, I'm a fan of that because then I can actually go look at, okay, where are you extracting this information from, and then does your interpretation make sense to me? Because that's another interesting thing. Sorry, this is going to be a little tangential, but
go for
I
it.
also find that there are some people who choose one route of coming back or debating on social media, right? Where when somebody will cite a study and then another person will say, "Oh, that study did not show this; they actually showed this." And
Hmm.
I always find that to be interesting because I think even that standpoint is it's a bit flawed because there are sometimes can be more than one way to interpret data. And
Hmm.
now some people are, have malintent and they actually will misinterpret data to boost their own agenda. But often that's not the case. And I think that if those, I'm somebody who's involved in research, I like to do research, and even myself and my co-authors, or even you and I, right? I mean, I would say we're co-authors, we're producing this thing
Sure.
today. Um, we have different interpretation of different things often. So a lot of times, even that aspect's interesting. But anyway, so I look at that citation and see if that makes sense to me and what I took away from that. And so that's kind of my initial process now.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what you're referring to is kind of Lane Norton, right? In terms of the former approach, where he'll take citations and papers and try to analyze, hey, this is not actually what the paper is talking about. You're trying to prove X, but actually this paper says Y, right? And
Mm.
like he's not looking at it from a malintent point of view. He's looking at it from an educational point of view and trying to actually have the viewers understand, right, like the research. And I mean, we're not going to go as deep as Lane Norton does or as Peter Attia does in terms of the data and looking at the numbers. But at least we'll try to give you a good perspective. So my bias, at least coming in when I see a post like that, right, talking about meat, is initially wanting to believe it, right, and coming out with energy. Because for the listeners, I'm sure you guys know this if you've been listening for a while. I don't eat meat, right? So I'm a vegetarian, and I've come to understand, and again, like Altamash, I've grown over the years to really dissect what it means in terms of propaganda, right, and what type of posts vegetarians, vegans, and on the flip side, carnivores are putting out there, right, to promote their own beliefs. And the key word is beliefs.
Mm.
So people have to understand that there are beliefs that are rooted in why people choose to do the things they do. Beliefs are different than science, okay? Science is, objective data and applying it and seeing how it can work clinically, and the science can be applied differently to different people. That's where you can't have beliefs go and permeate through the world and say, hey, everyone has to believe what I believe, right?
Mm-hmm.
I grew up vegetarian. If I maybe were, born or grew up in the States, born in the States from family who was in the States, my parents were American or something, then maybe I would have grown up eating meat, right? I keep that in the back of my mind. So that's kind of the bias that I come in with, right? Is a very one of like, oh man, I wish this was true. But wait, hold up. That's just my belief because I don't eat meat. And then, the ego can come in the way with kind of a superiority complex or something, right? Saying like, the way I live is quote unquote better than what everyone else does, right? So that's essentially the bias that I'm coming in with.
Yeah, and I think you address a really important point. I think um, when people masquerade, the scariest thing of all is when people masquerade around disguising beliefs as science, right?
Mm.
That's what gets really scary. Like
Yeah.
if it's your belief, you call it out, but like I don't do this because this is what I believe or this is my faith or whatever. And dude, that's so cool. That's so cool to me. I mean, kind of respect on that, right? And that's where we can agree to disagree. That's fine. But when you again to say the science supports this and it doesn't actually do that, that's where it becomes a problem. So let's take on that for now, right? Okay, so
Yeah.
I want to maybe start off with the most complex and take a top down approach. I think the meat causing cancer thing, which is so ridiculously in depth, and this is something that kind of like Groundhog Day. It happens every 2 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And most of the time when people are talking about meat causing cancer, they're really referring to red meat, right, or
Mm-hmm.
processed meat.
Yep.
And whether it's the media taking a headline, a couple of years ago, 2019, it was like the New York Times and a couple
Yeah.
others. I feel like 2014, there was another one. In 2011, there was a big thing. It just keeps happening over and over again. And I think, there is some merit to that. But the most important thing for us to remember is that maybe on a population level, there's an association between red meat and cancer, and
Mm-hmm.
specifically colorectal cancer. Remember that cancer is you can't just use it as an umbrella term. If there's an association between one specific type of cancer, somebody else who might have that cancer or has a family history of a cancer risk, that information is not applicable. What we all really appreciate is when we see a study in high school female gymnastics, we don't say, "Oh, okay, this applies to me." If it's like you have a population of senior citizen, Japanese males, like that doesn't always apply. So that's easier for us to see. But when it comes with these types of things, it gets really, really scary, right? Because I think that cancer, one, it's scary. Two, everybody is a perceived expert on nutrition because we put it in our bodies multiple times a day. So automatically, you think you have some credibility when it comes to that, and so that's where it gets really scary. But the most important thing I think when it comes to stats and science is correlation does not mean causation, right? So just because something is associated doesn't mean there's a cause and effect.
Right.
And I'll pause there to see if you have some thoughts, because that is, I think, the most important thing to remember that people who are not scientifically trained keep in mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's that's like the number one statement that I think all researchers are just trying to get across, right? People who analyze is that correlation, right, or associations. That's just like, hey, if age goes up, then so does your telomere like shortening, right, or whatever. Like that's
Or gray
they're
hair or
or
death
gray
or
hair,
really
right?
anything.
Right. Those are related, right? But age necessarily doesn't cause those things, right? It's not a direct X happens to Y. It's just that those are associated. So I think that's the one thing, people who really want to start learning to get into the science have to keep in mind. I mean, even when looking at posts and looking at people who claim things, the first thing you should ask yourself is, wait, is this a cause and effect, or are these things maybe just related in some way? Right. And I think even just discerning that will give you a lot of space now to think for yourself and really to start thinking like, okay, well, what about this situation or this situation or this situation? Right. And what we're starting to learn is not only is the human body complex, but like just the entirety of everything that we have learned as a human species is complex in it of itself. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, people will say, well, how can that be? Like, why is it not the case? And I think that maybe expanding on that is worth it, right? So when there's an association, right, it's hard to tease out, like you alluded to, that there's various other factors that could be contributing. In the
Mm,
case of cancer, right, you have genetics, you can have predispositions there, family history, we know that's important. You can have environmental factors, right? You can have exposures, you can have different mutations that can attribute, and so et cetera, that can attribute to that specific type of cancer. And so putting it on one specific thing, meat, red meat, dye, whatever, insert thing,
yeah.
that's really, really harder. So these things are called confounders, right? There's a lot of confounding
Hmm.
variables that can contribute to it, right? For instance, like if we look at just something that actually has been documented and shown to have the quote strongest evidence, albeit still weak in the grand scheme of things, is the risk of processed meats and colorectal cancer, right? And again, colorectal cancer specifically, nothing else. But that data still has a lot of confounding factors, right? So smoking, alcohol, they tend to increase that as well, right? Those people who tend to be in those groups who are whose intake of processed meats is higher, they also tend to have higher BMIs. They have to have a higher caloric load, right?
Hmm.
Their overall consumption of fruits and vegetables is far less,
Lower. Yeah.
right? In general, and I mean, we could dive so much deeper into how fruits and vegetables are protective, so they can actually negate some of the negative effects of meat consumption. But these people also have a lower socioeconomic status. They have a lower
Hmm.
cardiorespiratory fitness. So, which one is it?
Right. Right.
How can one say that it's the meat? There's no way to know unless we conduct an experiment, which would be incredibly unethical, to do a study, like a long or really a short-term study, because cancer takes years and years to develop,
Sure.
to be able to prove that, right? So when people come out and definitively say that, yeah, meat's the one that's causing it, I'm like, how the f do you know?
Right, right. And I think the way you said that is a great way for people to think about it is, okay, you have meat and we're looking at, is it causing this? Well, hold up, let me take a step back. What other things could potentially be associated with this that could make it worse or make it better, right? So shall we dive into the two research papers here that we found through Examine?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So the first one, and we're going to link these in the show notes, both of these papers, but the first one is basically looking at an association of red meat and heart disease. All right. And so essentially, they did a meta analysis of 24 randomized controlled trials, right? So, what is a meta analysis? So, essentially, let's say you have six papers, papers A, B, C, D, E, F, and you're essentially going to come out with the meta analysis, which is going to be a separate paper which analyzes all of those other six and tries to come up with some sort of direction with that, right? So some sort of association or data analysis that they can put while looking at six different studies. Now, typically they say meta-analyses are the goals, the best type of research that you can do because you're analyzing so many different things from a general overview perspective. But if you have six crappy papers, then you probably will come out with a crappy meta-analysis, right? So it really depends. Okay, so when you hear the word meta-analysis, don't think, oh, this is automatically right off the bat going to be amazing. The good part about this study, though, is that it's 24 randomized control trials, right? And now we know randomized control trials is kind of with intervention what we would like to see. If we could have a gold standard for every single experiment out there in the world, it would probably be a double blinded randomized control trial. All right, so we have 24 of those, and we're going to analyze all of that. So what are they looking at? Again, red meat and heart disease. And so the question is, how are they going to measure the red meat consumption? So essentially, they broke it down into servings. So zero.5 servings, less than zero.5 servings of red meat, or greater than 0.5 servings of red meat. And these 24 studies range from either 2 weeks to 32 weeks. And what they were measuring was lipid markers, right? So your HDL, LDL, triglycerides, as well as blood pressure. Okay, so we're looking at less than zero point 0.5, greater than 0.5 serving on these two things, lipid markers and blood pressure. And what they found was that there was no difference at all in any of the lipid markers, whether you were eating less than zero point 0.5 or greater than zero point 0.5, except for your HDL. But your HDL was only higher in greater than 3 servings of red meat. But now typically you're saying, oh, well, that's bad, right? Well, typically you want your HDL to be higher, right? So here we're actually finding, hey, this might be a positive outcome, increasing your HDL with greater than 3 servings of red meat. But if you look at, increased blood pressure, which would be a bad thing, increased LDL, increased triglycerides, they're not finding a difference in that with less than 0.5 servings or greater than 0.5 servings.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that that's the important thing. I'm sorry. Tell me, did they define what a serving is? How do they quantify that? Did they give that in grams or anything like that, or
You
no?
know what? I think they were talking about ounces. I would have to look back and see. I
Okay.
can't remember, but I think,
Okay.
yeah, it was some sort of ounces, 3 or so.
Yeah. And when they said red meat in this paper, did they specify what the source of the meat was? Like, was
I
it
think
beef?
so.
Was it pork? Was it, what was it?
Yeah, it was all of those combined. So they actually have a pie
Okay.
chart, and it was processed, unprocessed, so different types of red meat and different ways of processing it.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, so full disclosure, I hadn't read this paper, and so I'm learning this information for the first time, just like you guys are. And again, my takeaway, as you see, there's a lot of follow up questions, right? How was the meat? What was it like? So there are more to that, and so that's exactly my process. Is like when you come across this type of information, I think that the first thought should probably be it's like, oh, tell me more if it's interesting, rather than take the conclusions and run with it, right?
Right,
Because
right.
as you just mentioned, even the highest, when we look at research for those, there's usually a pyramid that you're looking at. And at the top of the pyramid suggests that you have systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And so even the meta-analyses can be really crap. It's, garbage in, garbage
Mm-hmm.
out type of situation. And so this one was a relatively decent one. And it suggested maybe, hey, it's overall, there isn't that big of a deal. I want to go back to talking about just the meat and its correlation with cancer, because I think that that's the one that probably is the most intimidating and again has the most noise. um, just like this study where they kind of combined looking at unprocessed and processed meats. Again, it's hard to tease out which is the culprit. Fortunately, when it comes to the cancer thing, there is some of the details have been ironed out a little bit better, and really they've been able to point a little bit more towards the processed meats. And the reason for that is right, these processed meats are in these nitrate based preservatives, which when they go into the body can be carcinogenic, right? And so nitrates, depending on the context, can be really, really good. So, for instance, beets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beets have a high amount of nitrates. They can actually increase athletic performance. They can be cardioprotective, to your point. But when their nitrates are coming from these preservatives and the processed meats, then they can be carcinogenic. And so again, context over content, really, really, really important. There are other propositions of how that could potentially happen, right? So when you're preparing your meat, that's another thing that's really, really important too, right? And
Yeah.
so it's really could be all about the preparation. So char broiling your meats, or like just charring the end of on a grill, or can
Yeah.
activate some of these compounds that can be again procarcinogenic. So these are things called heterocyclic amines, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, again
Mm-hmm.
nitrosamines in particular, that can cause an issue. But as I mentioned before, often these pathways that are going into your body, even after you're ingesting these things, some of the literature supports that if you do a 1-to-1, like taking green vegetables after eating something like that, that can counteract that, because they can bind to some of these things and it won't potentially have a negative effect. So that's another interesting thing as well, is because often, when in these studies, when people are consuming these amounts of meat, they're not they're not having both usually, right? So it's one or the
Right.
other. So when you're comparing two groups, you're like, okay, I'm going to take a vegetarian quote unquote group. They're consuming lots of vegetables, and we've talked at length about how vegetables are good for you. They're good for your heart. They're good for a lot of different things, and unfortunately, standard American diet doesn't have a lot of that. That's why we keep shouting out Isi Sinkowski, because she has gamified consuming vegetables and fruits, because they have a lot of amazing properties that can help. They can be anti-cancer, anti-cardiovascular disease. Really, insert any disease, and they're probably going to be good for you. Unless you listen to some people who will tell you that they'll kill you, then that's a different
Right.
story. But
Which is why we're here.
but and hey, and listen, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that is we don't have it figured out either, right?
Yeah, that's true.
But I think we're educated enough, and we've done this for long enough to know that sometimes we see these insane claims, or like, let's just take a step back and maybe not freak out. Because quite frankly, man, I used to be in that group where I would see this and it would freak me out, right? Because I'm a
Yeah.
pretty health conscious individual. I've openly declared about how that was affecting my sleep situation, right? And so nutrition, it's no different, right? It's so intertwined in our lives every hour of the day, that anxiety in itself, that's going to kill you before like the actual
Yeah.
meat does.
The worried well, right? Is what
Yeah.
EC says. So yeah, and to your point, I love how you ask questions right after I kind of present that data, right? I mean, that should be everyone's initial triggers. Wait, let me take a step back. What other information do I need to know? Because oftentimes in a social media post or a major newspaper, they would probably put like major HDL changes after eating red meat, right? And right off the bat, you'd be like, "Oh my God, let me send this to my whole family. This headline is crazy." But then, if you're the smart person, you'd click on that link, or you'd click on the link in order to click on the paper, right? Because very rarely do they even cite the data within that article. So go to the original paper, look at it, read it, see what's going on. What are they actually doing with the methods? And then you'll be like, okay, they took one little thing and then even exaggerated that. So that is what is important.
Yeah. All right, so let's shift gears. You want to talk about the other paper that you came across?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one was also an examine. And again, when you go on Google, the post we saw was meat causes, and then it also said autoimmune disease, diabetes. So this one is about effects of total red meat intake on glycemic control and inflammatory biomarkers. This was a paper done by O'Connor and al. So they took adults greater than 19 years old with no cardiometabolic disease, and they randomized them to different quantities of red meat over 3 to 16 weeks. And the things they were measuring were fasting glucose, insulin, um, HB1AC. I don't even know what the other one was. So A1C, C-reactive protein, right, which is an inflammatory marker, and then some other pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6, and then TNF alpha, which is something else that gets secreted during an inflammatory state. So what they found through this, right, after eating red meat of different quantities, over 3 to 16 weeks, was no difference for any of the outcomes, even in a dose response manner, right? So even if you're eating more and more meat, they're not finding a difference in any of those markers, inflammatory markers or markers that are associated with diabetes in any way, right? So that's kind of what that paper was talking about.
Were there any different? Did you mention BMI, and were there any differences, and did they control for that?
I don't think they did. I don't think they control for BMI. When I was looking through the paper, I didn't see anything about looking at weight or BMI. I think it was strictly just looking at these lab
Yeah.
markers.
Yeah, so I mean, these types of things are so important. I like that though. I think that, in preparation for this, I think both you and I took a slightly different angle. Like, you were looking at the cardiovascular stuff and the metabolic stuff, and I was kind of focusing on it from the cancer perspective.
Hmm.
I don't know why I did that though, because the cancer thing is so incredibly dense and complicated that I
Well,
mean,
I
I just
think
yeah.
honestly, I think it's because like even Peter Attia talks about this, right? Like, sure, red meat is carcinogenic based off the way you can prepare it and things.
Hmm.
But if you look at the grading system, right, from like A being okay, this will definitely absolutely cause cancer, like
Hmm.
cigarettes, to B, C, D. Red meat is like the lowest on the totem pole. It's like, sure, there's a risk, but that relative risk is not that high,
Yeah.
unless of course you go beyond and smoke all your meat and char it and then eat massive
So
quantities. So
that reminds me. I'm glad you brought that up. So I haven't seen this. What's it called? Like cancer sticks, or what did you say?
yeah, bacon or the new cancer stick.
Cancer stick. Okay. So I'm
Right.
glad that people brought that up and they use smoking as an example, right? So just to give people some context. So, right. So a lot of this nutrition stuff, it's it's based off of what we call epidemiological studies, right? And if you're really involved in the research, you're not a fan of them, but um, it's the best we have when it comes to population level stuff, right? Because you can't put millions of people in random. Again, the best thing you can do is kind of take a meta-analysis or systematic review where you can pool large amounts of data. So you have to take epidemiological study where you can take large population, large N, right, which is the number of people that are in study, and look at it that way. And so to give people an idea, there's one thing that we look at. We look at these things called there's something called hazard ratios, right? So a hazard ratio, it's like it has to be above one, and that tells you that there's a certain percentage increase. So, for instance, if there's a hazard ratio of two for something, right? So if smoking gave lung cancer and the hazard ratio is two, that means that you essentially doubled your risk. Does that make sense? Right. So if
Mm-hmm.
you have a hazard ratio of 1.16, that means that there's like a 16% increase. It's not, it's not the effect size. The magnitude is actually very, very small. And so,
Mm-hmm.
people will say, well, we've changed the way we discuss public health messages and smoking and alcohol and stuff like that. And that's based off epidemiological studies. I assure you that those studies, their relative risk ratios and the hazard ratios are far, far greater. We're talking in the 100%, a thousands percent. Like, for instance, I forget where I read this, but the relative risks for smoking and lung cancer associations was like 111% increase at one point. I'll have
Right.
to look that up. Whereas when it comes to talking about red meat being carcinogenic, it's like uh, a total of like 3% increase, right? And
Right.
so um, that's one thing. And then kind of what you just suggested right there is like the dose really makes a poison,
Yeah.
right? Kind of hate using that cliche term, but it's
Yep.
applicable here, right? If you're eating two burgers, grass-fed burgers, right, lean beef a week, it's not the same as consuming massive amounts of charred meat 3 to 4 times a day. Like that's completely different than how you're gonna. And then also, if you're eating lots of vegetables and stuff, like it's part of a healthy diet, that's going to be. It's just completely different, right? And so again, we have to see where it's applicable.
Right. And I think a lot of people here might be thinking, well, what about the carnivore diet? Aren't those people eating like tons and tons of meat? It's like, yeah, absolutely. But hopefully they're doing it quote unquote correctly, right? Like they're eating the healthy, organic, non GMO, non antibiotic meats that are coming. And not all of that is red meat either, right? And I know Paul Saladino and those and that camp are starting to incorporate, more fruits or some veggies at least. And hopefully there might be some, like you said, effects that will take away from the meat. But
Yeah.
it's definitely interesting, right? And I think this is the thing that I need to learn more about. I'm sure you do as well, is more in terms of the effects. But this carnivore diet is so new that we don't there's no way we're going to find out the data from that in the last like 3-4 years, right? I mean, these things take a while for the body to process and clinically show something.
Yeah, and I think so. The other issue that becomes is that a lot of these things. So the carnivore diet, it's a classic example, right? It's a hypothesis generated off mechanistic data or animal
Mm-hmm.
studies or in vitro studies, right? These are studies that are non-human studies. So in vitro studies are in petri dish animal models or in mice models. Again, I don't have to explain to people what the difference is. Um, so you take this and you have mechanistic data and say, hey, this makes sense in my scientific left brain, and therefore I should use it. But I should do this and apply it. But again, we have to caveat the way we're communicating this information. That's not the same as, oh, we have, again, large human studies for 20, 25 years that we know something to be true. And so, yeah, only time will tell for somebody who's been on a carnivore diet or really any diet that is extreme, I'll call it, on one either spectrum. Really, this is that pendulum that we keep talking about on either spectrum, um, and see what happens after 10, 15, 20 years, right? Of in that individual. That's the other thing. What you mentioned is everybody's
Yeah.
body is a little bit different, so how you process that might be completely different than how I process it.
100%.
Marie Spano,
Mm-hmm.
I think you're familiar with her, right? So on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, she
Yep.
actually had a really good post today talking about how if you are a vegan or vegetarian, these are the micronutrients or that you're going to be missing out on, right? A couple
Mm-hmm.
things like if you're going to be missing out on DHA and vitamin B12 and that kind of stuff. And in medicine, really first year medical student, you learn about the issues and the specific diseases somebody might present with that kind of stuff. If you're a carnivore diet, you might be missing on X, Y, and Z, fiber, vitamin C, that kind of stuff. So that's something important to keep in mind as well is if you could be on either end of the spectrum, you're going to be, there's an opportunity cost to that. Right. And so,
Yeah.
um, and unless you're supplementing with that, and then I would ask, well, are supplements healthy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Are
That's gonna have to be
supplements
another
killing you?
episode.
Yeah, that's
For
that's
sure, that'll be an episode.
it could go on and on, right? And so yeah, man,
Yeah.
it's all very, very interesting, and it's all very polarizing, and also scary.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So takeaways. All right. So after you did your research and you learning about this stuff, are you gonna stop eating meat?
Hmm. So, I think I didn't answer your question about the biases in the beginning. No, I do. I enjoy my meat. Pause. Um, there, there, there is a there is just a little
We are
immature.
not gonna take that out.
There,
That's amazing.
yeah, that's amazing. Yeah. Um, Here's what I've started doing. Right. Adding more vegetables and fruit. Again, so this concept of subtraction by addition, which I'm a fan of, right? So just really
Mm-hmm.
making it a point to eating more vegetables and stuff when you just don't have room to think about chicken. And I'm not a big red meat person anyway, and I certainly don't ever eat processed. I shouldn't say ever, but almost 99.9% you're not going to see me eating processed meat, so that's less of a
Mm-hmm.
concern. um,
Okay.
but again, I go back to this thing about dose makes a poison. Like, that's really, really important. I have been more cognizant over the last several years about my preparation strategies for meat. Like, for instance, I used to love grilling, right? And sometimes I'm also a little bit scatterbrained and multitasking in medical school. I would always grill, and then I'd be studying, come back, and then chicken get burned a little bit. I'm like, whatever, it's still good chicken. It's chicken breast, it's expensive, I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
eat it anyway. And I don't do that as much anymore, right? And so
Okay.
so that's one thing that I've changed up a little bit. Not eating like actually charged stuff, understanding how that actually potentially could have a negative effect. But ultimately, in terms of prevention strategies, as simple as eating more fruits and vegetables is going to confer so many different positive benefits
Mm-hmm.
that it's understated.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think my takeaway here is, of course, I don't eat meat as I stated in the beginning, but more from a social media perspective now is when I see these posts, even from my vegan and vegetarian colleagues, it's kind of educating them, right? And saying, hey, a belief doesn't equal science, right? And, I respect your beliefs. I have the same belief. There's a reason why I'm vegetarian still. And but we don't have to impose through propaganda to get people to switch, right? I think that's what a lot of people are trying to do is make people switch one way or the other to get them on their side with this tribe mentality. And I just don't think that's the proper approach. Now, questions that the audience may have is, well, like, okay, well, if you're a vegetarian, what about protein, right? That can be a separate progress note episode in itself. We can always talk about supplementation in a separate episode as well. So, as you see, like, nutrition's complex, right? One question raises a whole bunch of other questions, which raise a whole bunch of other questions. And so, this is why we started this project, is to kind of go down the weeds and see where we can end up and uncover as much as possible. One thing I will say though is that meat can absolutely kill you in this one instance, which is if you get the Lone Star tick bite, and which is a tick out in the Northeast, and actually not the North. It's mainly Southeast and East Coast.
Yeah, I thought it was like Texas in the area.
Yeah, yeah, it is. And then I was just Googling it, and it said like Southeast and East mainly. So I don't know if these things are migrating or not, but yeah, Lone Star, right? It should be Texas, Lone Star state. And they can bite you. And if you end up getting an infection, sometimes you can get this thing called an alpha gal allergy. So this is a type of sugar in red meat that you're now allergic to. So people have actually died from eating red meat without knowing that they had this allergy. So in that case, I don't know. I'd have to look more into it to see, like, does this allergy go away? Are there ways to kind of reduce the response? But I have seen that people gotten anaphylaxis from it. So that is one interesting way that meat can kill you.
Um, that was actually really neat. Fun fact, might be the coolest thing we learned today. I just quick Wikipedia search. It seems like it's really all of Eastern United States. So really all the way down
Oh,
from
okay.
the eastern part of Texas all the way up to the New England states. Yeah, that is interesting, and it's an ugly looking thing. But yeah, stay away from that. And if you
Yeah,
know you have that allergy, then certainly avoid meat at all. Causes
absolutely.
something that actually just occurred to me that when you were bringing up these studies that I forgot to mention. is I remember coming across a paper again when I was researching this, and I think this was by Schoenfield and Ioannidis was on the paper. I know that, and so yeah, it's Jonathan Schoenfield, and this is a paper in 2013 in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Essentially, the title is "Everything We Eat Associated with Cancer." It's a systematic cookbook review. You might have heard about this. Tia talk about this, and basically what they did is they randomly took 50 ingredients and some of the common like out of a cookbook recipes, 50 random ingredients, and just did PubMed searches on that to see if each of the ingredients has an association with cancer, or if there's a study looking at the association with cancer. 40 out of the 50, there is at least one study documenting either an increase or a decreased risk with cancer, right? So negative or positively. So I don't know if that kind of helps us bring it all together here. Is that and I think that there was a paper an article that came out afterwards said basically saying, hey, it's everything that we're ever eating causing cancer. And again, context over content. I think that we've said that multiple times here, and I think it's really, really applicable yet again. So hopefully people can remember that.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So the opposite can always hold true. So you can Google meat can cause, and you can also Google meat does not cause. And those keywords at the end will stay exactly the same. You can try it at home, because I've tried it, and it's just funny and comical to see that and see how people will only see it in one way. But yeah, so I came across this quote that during my meditation yesterday, and I was like, damn, I've got to say this during our progress note, because this is just so fitting for at least like the first episode. And it's a quote by Alan Watts, and he says, "We can never describe all features of the total situation, not only because every situation is infinitely complex, but also because the total situation is the universe." Now, it's a little meta, a little philosophical, but essentially what it's saying is, hey, every situation, every single question we ask, everything is related, right? And like you said, you can Google it one way, find something in the other direction. And we're just humans on this earth trying to figure out the truth, which, we'll keep seeking and seeking. So one step closer.
Amen.
All right. Well, hopefully you guys all enjoyed that. Leave us some feedback, and we'll see what we'll do for number 2. Cool.
Everybody.
Thank you so much for tuning in, Redefiners. If you enjoyed this new initiative, please leave a rating and review. And as always, please share this episode with someone who needs to hear it and who wants to learn, meat and the topics surrounding red meat and cancer and metabolic health is very polarizing. And so it's important for us to get this episode out into the hands of others out there who can really learn from this information. And if you have any topics that you want Altamash and I to break down, whether you see posts on Instagram or TikTok, please feel free to share them. We are on Instagram and TikTok as Med Redefined. And you can also email us any topics that you want us to do a deep dive in at medredefined@gmail.com. And as always, the medical disclaimer, everything in this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute the practice of medicine, and we are not providing medical advice. No physician-patient relationship is formed, and anything discussed in this podcast does not represent the views of our employers. We recommend that you seek the guidance of your personal physician regarding any specific health-related issues. We'll see you next time.